and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird, and I'm the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. While the Graduate Center at CUNY is now open for classes, we are not allowed to hold any public events in the auditorium. So this autumn semester, all our Leon Levy events will be on Zoom. Please note that we have two upcoming events. On November 9th, we are hosting Jason Riley to talk about his new biography of Thomas Sowell. He will be in conversation with Robert George. And on the very next day, November 10th, again at 6 p.m., the celebrated English biographer Claire Tomalin will be speaking about her new biography on H.G. Wells. She will be in conversation with Edward Mendelsohn. Please mark your calendars and register for these events on the Leon Levy website. And also, please encourage your friends and relatives to subscribe to our digital mailing list on our website. There's a little box, you can just add your email and then you get notices about our events. But tonight we are here to celebrate the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Debby Applegate, who will be in conversation with Gerald Howard about her fascinating new book, Madam, the biography of Polly Adler, icon of the jazz age. I believe the publication date for this book is today, and we are very timely. And I notice today, the New York Times has a front page review on this book. It's just fabulous. Couldn't be better for a biographer. He's worked so many years on this book. I read this book when it was in galleys, and I was delighted to write this blurb for it. Quote, Madam is an astonishing book, a stunning achievement by Debby Applegate, who takes the life of Polly Adler, a nice Jewish girl from the Pale of Russia, and uses it to craft a wholly new history of New York in the jazz age. Applegate names the names, but her thoughtful narrative is not mere expose, but serious history, examining the dreary mechanics of the American dream. Applegate's Madam is a formidable work in both scholarship and just good writing. Debby Applegate won the Pulitzer Prize for biography for her very first book, The Most Famous Man in America, the biography of Henry Ward Beecher. She earned a PhD in American Studies from Yale University and lives in New Haven. Gerald Howard recently retired from Doubleday, where he edited both of Applegate's biographies. His essays and reviews have appeared in a variety of publications. He is currently at work on a biographical study of the editor and critic Malcolm Cowley. Please look for Madam at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. We will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we will take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the question box, the chat box below, to type in your questions, and Gerald will be sure to get to as many as he can. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. And now I turn this conversation over to Gerald Howard. Thank you, Jerry.
Well, thank you, Kai, for those lovely words. And hello there, Debby. Well, we're continuing a conversation we've been having for a long time about Polly Adler, and it's been such a pleasure talking to you about it all these years, right? So let's dive right in. I mean, the first thing that I think most people will notice is that there's a radical shift in subject matter here in your practice as a biographer from the most famous religious figure in the American 19th century, Henry Ward Beecher, to the most famous madam or brothel keeper in the first half of the 20th century. So why don't you first tell people how you came to choose Polly Adler as your next subject?
I feel like this is a story of me bamboozling myself or being bamboozled by my own weakest traits. I found the process, as you well know, as some of the people who I see, friends and family who are in the audience well know, that I found that process of finishing that first biography very difficult. I think all biographers do, but I was absolutely certain that this biographer was never going to be fool enough to do that again. Anyone who has spent any time with biography writing knows it's all books are arduous, but there is something especially arduous and challenging about trying to boil down a single life. It sounds like it should be simple, but it is actually, it's like you can find a whole life on the head of a pin. And so you have to look at every pin. I swore I was never going to do it again. And in fact, I trace it to a night that you were there, Jerry, as was Bill Thomas, the head of Doubleday, and my agent, Susan Rabiner, and my husband, Bruce Tolgan. We were all celebrating after an award ceremony, and I was feeling vain. And I was feeling weakened by my time in the sun. And I believe it was you who said, you know, if you wrote another book, why not the 1920s? And
no,
I do, and I can't
That's
imagine
how I remember it.
Well, it's a myth in my mind. Somebody said it. Somebody said, well, my husband said, why not Calvin Coolidge? To which that one was that flew no one with no one. But you know, something a little racy, something with some suicide, or something with some prohibition and some sex and gambling. And it stewed around in my mind because, in fact, like most people who like American literature, it's hard not to be seduced by the 20s. I'm sure many people in the audience will say that you can't read. Everyone has to read Scott Fitzgerald. Everyone has to read Hemingway. And once you start down that path, it's hard not to find it enchanting because there is so much. There's so much change going on there. There's so much colorful cultural transformation happening that anyone would find it interesting. But that still didn't lead me to Polly. It just led me to think, well, I'll read some books. And I was in the Yale stacks, the library stacks, just walking, strolling through the 1920s books. And there was a little red volume that I think I only pulled it up because it was a scarlet color, which just goes to show advertising works. And it was a little bright color, and as for my magpie eyes. And it was Polly Adler's 1953 memoir, A House Is Not a Home. Most people today have not read it. It was a huge, huge bestseller. We sold 2 million copies, vaulted her into international literary celebrity, much to her great gratification. It was reprinted in, I think, a dozen languages. And it is a great book. It isn't exactly all true, of course, it turns out. I guess most memoirs
a little polished by her fancy ghost, Virginia Faulkner, but it has the goods. And it just occurs to me that, well, we're almost come to the end when I say this, that Polly's quest for respectability was gratified posthumously because that book is in print from New England University Press.
Yeah. Oh,
she made it to the colleges.
Exactly. All she wanted was an education. She swore that and to be rich and respected. And she got most of that. She even got herself a junior college degree right at the end as she was finishing her book. And it's a great book. I actually really recommend it, even if it is whitewashed and only partial. And that was enough. That was enough. I don't know why that was enough for you, but it was enough for me to put together a proposal. And I could tell there was more there. I didn't know what more would be there. And I was shocked at how much was there, but that was what started it.
Well, how I remember it was that you said that you were rummaging around in the 20s and interested in the period, as one certainly would be. And we said, Bill Thomas and I said, yeah, 20s, that's good. And Bill Thomas, I believe, said, but what you have to find is a Gatsby figure, a connector, somebody where all the highs and the lows of the 20s connected. And then you came up with Polly Adler, and I was aware of her because I tend to be aware of disreputable things. And
although you must have just been a kid when it came out, just a kid.
But no, of course I was 3, but over it was one of these racy things that the adults would refer to obliquely, and you say, what? And said, oh, no, nothing, you know. and then of course it was made into a pretty lousy movie. So anyway, I was aware, and so we said go, and you went. So we're going to be talking a lot about the 20s, but obviously, but I want to go back to the beginning, because as I kept on saying in presenting your book, the first part of your book is like an immigrant story that will remind people of Henry Roth or Mike Gold or Daniel Fuchs or similar writers. So, I mean, this was a girl from the shtetl, and who came in the early years of the century. To tell us how Pearl Adler came to the United States.
Well, you know, that was one of the many things I spent more time on than I thought I would, and also had far more resources than I had any right to expect. I knew that there was a massive Jewish migration at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century that lasted up until 1924, when the immigration laws changed and radically cut down on the number of immigrants from Russia and from Southern Europe. So and that part of her story seemed familiar, but I didn't really understand why so many people were leaving Russia. So one thing I spent a lot of time on is trying to figure out what was happening in her childhood. And of course, the rise of a increasingly crushing anti-Semitism was a huge part of the story, the diminishment of economic activity or opportunity. She was a very ambitious girl, kind of, I think of her like a Margaret Fuller character who was raised as the oldest daughter by a father who I think would have liked to have a son, but instead he got himself a very smart, very clever, very funny and personable daughter. So this was also unusual. They decide the whole family is going to move to America, where the opportunities are greater. They're going to go in 1913, but it's too expensive for everyone to go all at the same time. So they decide, her father decides he's going to send the children, as she says, in installments. And so she's going to be the first as the oldest. And that was also unusual to me, and unusual even at the time, that girls would travel alone. She was only about 13 or 14 years old, at no older than 14, probably about 13. And by the time she got here and got settled in, staying with a family she didn't know very well, 6 months later, World War I begins and there is no more travel. Her family is trapped in Russia and she is trapped here alone. And that is really when she begins her odyssey of having to make her own choices and chart her own path, the primrose path, as Shakespeare would say.
And so she starts out in Springfield with relatives. And
Springfield, Massachusetts, important, many Springfields in America.
Springfield, Massachusetts. And then, but they don't let her finish school, which she's enjoying. And then they sent her to another family in Brownsville. We're really back in Mike Gold, Henry Roth territory now. And she works in a sweatshop. She gets herself into some trouble with some fast guy in Coney Island. And she eventually moves to the Lower East Side. She may like many of the young women in her position, may have um, been a prostitute herself for a bit, but obviously you can't prove that. But at a certain point, she runs into a guy, and you really can't make this up, named Nick Montana from,
right.
from Central Casting, who decides that she has a head for business and that he'll stake her to an apartment that she can turn into a call house, as they say, right?
Yep, that's right. That's right. It was right across from Columbia University, very convenient. I don't know who, but possibly there were some young men around there. That was really her first moment of leadership. And it's just as well, she almost certainly did turn tricks, to use the phrase. People do not go into management without having ever worked in the trade, no matter what the trade is. But she didn't last long, and that's good because, frankly, it's a very difficult job. It's not something that she herself would recommend for anyone. But she made a success of it right away. She had a fabulous head for math. She had a great memory. She was very personable. She knew how to run a home that was, a place that was a homey sort of hangout, but also was hard-nosed. And that made all the difference. She still thought, however, at the beginning, she was just going to do it for a little while. Then she was going to make as much money as she possibly could. And frankly, you could make 3 to 5 times in a week, maybe more, sometimes as much as 20 times in a week. More than you could working legitimately as a young woman, especially a young woman like her without any skills or training or education. She starts making money hand over fist. She saves enough money and she decides she's going to open a dress shop. As anyone can testify who has ever opened a small retail shop, you think being in the sex trade is hard. Try running a small retail business. She quickly decides it's too hard. The profit margins are too low.
The lingerie had a habit of walking out the door, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And quite frankly, this might be something she fibs about. I know at the end, she was actually running some girls out of the shop, using the phone to send people on dates and trussing them up with her lingerie. So very quickly, by the end of fall of 1923, she says enough of the legitimate business. She's going to go back into the sex trades and work until, as she puts it, she's saved enough money that she can really get out, never have anyone look down on her, and marry some nice Jewish boy, just like she'd always planned.
Right. Well, then the United States government gives her business quite a nice push by passing the Volstead Act, and which I guess was 1920 or 21, and that's the accelerator, prohibition, that makes the 20s roar, and then she's off to the races. Now there were plenty of people, plenty of women running brothels all up and down the main stem, as you call Broadway, but none of them, we remember almost none of them today, except Polly Adler. Why was Polly Adler so good, and how did she become that paradoxical thing, a famous madam? What was it? What did she have? What were her business practices?
Well, some of it was business practices. She was a little more clever than some, but I would even say she herself says, she was a creature of the times, of prohibition, of this moment when the underworld becomes a sexy subculture instead of just something like saloon culture, which was just a working class blue collar thing to look down on. All of a sudden, the idea of slumming the idea that, you know, even if you just want to have a glass of beer, you're going to have to consort with criminals, makes the idea of breaking the law seem a lot more like a lark, like a naughty thing to do, as opposed to something that is just completely disgraceful. But and so part of it is she enters the trade in 1920, just as Prohibition is coming in, but also she's of a certain age and a certain background that is true of a lot of the big gangsters of that period and a lot of the big immigrant entrepreneurs of that period, which is she was born in another country, but she comes here young enough that she becomes pretty thoroughly American. She has an American attitude towards money, an American attitude towards women's attitudes, towards all sorts of things. So she really embodies a more modern sensibility. A lot of the other madams were older. They, if you will, stunk of the ghetto. They were not young. They were not hip. They were not in touch with the zeitgeist of the culture. And she really was. So that's part of it. Part of it is also, she is terrific at publicity. That's her biggest thing. She realizes these nightclubs and these speakeasies that are springing up like mushrooms all over New York City are perfect showcases for her girls. Anyone who deals in black market wares will tell you that the hardest part about it being an illegitimate business is finding your customers and getting customers you trust, because you can't advertise, you can't have a shop window. And those nightclubs where she would parade in at the peak time with a posse full of her prettiest girls, spend a bunch of money, meet a bunch of guys, and many of them would just follow her home or take a card for later. That was probably her best and biggest trick. She used that all the time.
Well, I want to say that over the course of editing your book and having a really good time doing it, my strongest takeaway from the book was how incredibly corrupt and violent the 1920s in New York and elsewhere, but especially in New York, and where and you know, we all have our images of the 20s from you know, people dancing the Charleston and bathtub gin and all of that, but the corruption of New York City from top to bottom, from every aspect of New York life, is just jaw-dropping. To me, it was a good time to be a cop, but every organ of municipal government could be bought. That's the first thing. And the second thing was the violence was seriously violent. I mean, we also have our pictures of the 20s from the Warner Brothers gangster epics of the 30s. But I mean, the gangsters are played by charismatic people like Jimmy Cagney and Paul Muni and Edward G. Robinson. These people like Dutch Schultz, her special friend, and Mad Dog Cole and Legs Dime. These were ugly, violent people. It was not a pretty picture. And I think, to just offer a compliment for the book, is what you do is you strip away a lot of the glamour from the 20s and you show it as it really was, which was a lot of fun, but you wouldn't want that world back, I don't think.
I ended up reading a lot about corruption because I couldn't quite understand how it could be how it could feel so different. Now, maybe I underestimate how corrupt we are today, but I think we are different. And it's certainly at the level of most levels of government and the police department, we are different. But once you're in that society where, you know, not every cop not every cop was shaking down criminals for bribes.
Except every vice cop.
Well, okay, every vice cop, and yeah. I don't want to cast too many aspersions, but I do think vice cops still have not the best reputation. Maybe partially it is said in both the underworld and among among police that, the problem with being a vice cop is you have to be at one with the community of vice. You have to be able to move in that community. You have to understand them. Sometimes you have to be able to act as if you are just you're undercover and you're part of them. And it puts you in constant proximity to the worst side of human nature. But, there's a reason we installed civil service exams and more rules and many things like that. But it also makes me think oftentimes how fragile our anti-corruption culture is. It wouldn't take all that much for us to go back to those days. Maybe I'm overly pessimistic, but I think we have to be on guard for that sort of thing all the time.
Well, there was glamour too. And Polly's gift for publicity showed itself in the way she cultivated a certain set of sophisticated writers. Famously, the Algonquin Circle tended to hang out at Polly's, and Robert Benchley was her very special friend. I'm not being coy about that. They were truly good friends, and I think Thurber would drop by from time to time, yeah. And Dorothy Parker would drop by, not for the main service being offered, but just to hang out and crack wise. So talk about Benchley and those folks.
Polly referred to her place as a speakeasy with a convenient harem nearby, and that too was something I had to really think about. Like, how could it be that so many mainstream people, so many high-end people, educated people, took prostitution for granted? So that was one thing to realize, that even for somebody like Benchley, who'd gone to Harvard, or Donald Ogden Stewart, his close friend, the humorist, yeah. And the guy who wrote Philadelphia Story and Holiday, he went to Yale, and their attitude towards prostitution was shaped by the fact that they were the very last generation, born around the turn of the century, more or less, that had open red light districts. When they were young, so that prostitution was just sort of a part of life. You didn't talk about it, but you knew they were over there on the other side of town, and it was expected that you might lose your virginity. In fact, you probably should lose your virginity with a prostitute. That was how it was considered, because it was safer. There really was a double standard of there were good women and there were bad women, and you married one and you laid as many of the other as you possibly could, as was commonly said. So Polly, that turned out to not be the tricky part. The tricky part was, how did Polly meet all these people? And that's where the culture comes in, is that this is a moment where everything feels like it's topsy-turvy, and in particular in New York City, where you have in the Midtown Broadway area, you have vaudevillians, you have Broadway actors, you have Tin Pan Alley musicians, you have all the
Jimmy Durante.
Yeah, right, Jimmy Durante, huge character in the book. Yeah. You have all the magazines and all the, there are so many, there are 13, actually there might be 15 newspapers in New York City when Polly arrives, and that's just on the scene, and that's just the main English-speaking newspapers. There are
and the gossip columns are becoming more and more powerful and widely read too. Right.
And everyone is mixing in these illegal spots that they're glamorous in a sleazy kind of way usually. And so you've got you've got the writers of the New Yorker sitting next to major bootleggers, who are also sitting next to boxers and sportsmen and everyone.
Society swells. I love saying that. Society swells.
Oh, I've got
Doc Whitney.
I have a vocabulary list that's 30 pages long of great phrases like that. And yeah, it's really, so she uses the writerly crowd that she starts to attract in the speakeasies and nightclubs who are drinking themselves to death eventually, smoking and drinking and running around. Then that's how the prestige of the writers is how she gets into the real money, the Vanderbilts and the Whitneys and the Harrimans and the Rockefellers. Well, really only one Rockefeller, I should say.
She has a high-end, a sort of more high-end fancy place over on the east side, on the other side of Grand Central. There may be people in the audience who have co-ops on the west side which were once Polly's, I mean, her places were kind of movable feasts, really.
Well, that gives it a real classy sound, doesn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, she was always on the run from cops and stick-up artists and drunken clients who were going to wreak havoc. So she had places everywhere. It is undoubted that many a fine gentleman and lady is living in one of her old, she liked to call them her houses of assignation.
That's such a nice way of putting
exactly.
it.
Well, and in fact, one of the great disappointments of taking so long with this book, many disappointments that it took so long, good things and bad things, was just her main brothel for many years was on West 54th Street, which right around the corner from my Doubleday's offices where you work.
Yeah, yeah.
And not much of a building, but that you didn't want a showy building. It was probably like most of the buildings on 54th Street and 57th Street, gangster owned. The building right next to it was owned by many a gangster, because it was safer, you know, better to live among your own kind. But she eventually had to move around the time the Depression sets in, because as the Depression comes in and Prohibition is repealed, all of a sudden you have all these gunmen, all these former bootleggers and hoodlums who were making a ton of money from booze, no longer have a stream of income because now their liquor sales, they've totally, by making it illegal or making it legal to drink, all of a sudden they've taken away their living. And the Depression, of course, makes everything harder. But for Polly, what it meant was that there were a ton more kidnapping. The Snatch Racket, as they called it, becomes a serious problem, that people are just being kidnapped off the streets. And Jock Whitney, in particular, the very, very wealthy heir to the Whitney fortune, in fact, at one point, one of the wealthiest men in the country, and certainly in many ways, American aristocracy. He's a very good friend of Polly's. He is a very good client of Polly's. She actually describes him in her memoir. She refers to him as Scotty. I don't know why she thought it was okay, but eventually Jock decides, I can't keep coming over to West 54th Street. That is a nest of criminals. I am going to be kidnapped. If you don't move, I won't be your patron anymore. And in fact, he said, I'll help you pay the rent, and offered credentials when she needed to go to the landlord with references. And that's when she moved to the East Side. And that's, of course, at the same time where all nightlife moves. She is right near the Stork Club, El Morocco, all the big nightclubs that we might remember from those movies in the 1940s.
So I'd like to get to the president in the room, FDR. You have only one hint from somebody who spoke to Polly, who was a friend of Polly late in her life, that FDR may have been a client of Polly's, which is pretty interesting. But I want to broaden the way of talking about this. Why was Polly Adler a threat to the New York Democratic machine and in general, and to FDR in particular in the beginning of the 30s? Just because she was. Mm-hmm. And I'd like you to talk about the nexus between Polly and her brothels and New York and national politics?
Well, that too, again, I feel like it's different. Maybe it's not quite as different as I think it is. But politicians at the time, as was observed by a number of crime reporters, were among her main clients. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. For one thing, politics was a more rough and tumble business, a lot closer to the streets at the time. So it wasn't perhaps quite so shocking that politicians would have more contact with criminals in their districts, people who come to them and need help or are willing to pay a little bribe to get some special favoritism in court or if they're arrested. So that's just a much more common thing. But even more important, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure this out, women, and this is still true, women can play a very important but subtle role when people are making deals. In the way that when people want to persuade someone to close a contract or to write an enthusiastic review or make a deal, quite often there will be a party. There will be a party that is quite grand. There will be lots of booze and there will be pretty women there. And sometimes, quite often, those women are paid. I mean, if you look at, I hate to make the Jeffrey Epstein comparison, but you can see that Jeffrey Epstein had his own personal predilections for these young women, but it is also true that that's how he also made friends with other influential and rich people by providing women. And the reason you do that is, first of all, softens the mood. It makes people more amenable to the kind of propositions you might be offering. But the other is it's a slight kind of blackmail, as one executive said, who used it. If I provide a prostitute for my buyer that I'm trying to woo to buy, to sign a contract, I know that he has spent the night with the prostitute. He knows I know, and it's a little something both that we share. We've had this fun night together, but it's also something I hold over his head. So
her customer base was a lot of ad agencies putting on a good time for their out-of-town
exactly
from the manufacturer from Cleveland or
exactly.
Akron.
Same thing with a lot of her showbiz. She was huge in the Hollywood community when people were still going back and forth from the coast all the time. All the money and the writing talent, the Broadway talent was in New York. All the filming was out there. So it became a thing that if you came from Hollywood, the first thing you did after you had your meetings was go to Polly Adler's, and you do it on the dime of the studio. And so it was common enough. It is common. I mean, in that case, even if we might have different attitudes about prostitution, I think the comparison to something like going to strip clubs, which is still a common business practice in some circles as a way to bond. But I would just say, let's go back to the politicians. Imagine, so if that's happening across the board in other businesses with politicians, it's more so. And in fact, above all, it's the gangsters wanting to woo the politicians who start using the prostitutes as these kind of grease to fix their deals. And then once you have a politician who has been using a prostitute or is involved with another woman who Polly has provided, even if he doesn't know it's a prostitute, it is a way of having something quite big over the head of a politician. And that's where things start.
Well, one of the secrets of her success was she knew how to dummy up. And there's this whole extraordinary thing going on in 1932 where she is being grilled by an investigator named Samuel Seabury, who has been tasked with investigating the multiple layers of corruption in New York. And he's very honest and very dogged. And one of the people she's grilling is Polly Adler, and then on top of which, there's this extraordinary thing that I don't think you read a lot about in most FDR books, but that the New York mob was there in Chicago to deliver, in part, the presidential nomination to FDR, which makes your head explode, right?
Well, they certainly, I'll tell you this, the mob certainly likes to take credit. They like to take credit at any time they have anything to do with it. But it is true that by that point, the syndicated crime system in the United States was deeply involved with the machine politics in the major cities, especially in the Northeast and the Midwest. So
we must mention Tammany Hall here. You didn't get elected to anything in New York without having Tammany Hall involved in some way.
Although I want to say, Polly, one of the things I only realized kind of at the end is not just did she know some Republicans, what her local Republican wardsman actually signed her naturalization application as a witness. So she was ecumenical in her political affiliations.
Oh, that's
good. Well, and she did. So one of the things that I wish I knew more about, because I do think it's actually more important than I was even able to say, is that she entertained Huey Long, the irascible senator from New Orleans, who the big kingfish, who is a mythic figure in American politics. And
he was the one person that FDR was scared of.
Yes, and in fact, he was critical.
Rightly so.
He was critical to getting the nomination, holding the Southern states who would have objected and who were willing to bolt because they didn't like that aristocrat from the Hudson Valley. She was the one thing she was most careful about in sharing were her relationships with politicians. The one she was never shy about sharing, however, was Jimmy Walker, the mythical the jazz mayor of New York, the night mayor of New York, who is still one of the most colorful, if corrupt figures. Maybe not the most corrupt, actually. Maybe that's part of his color. Just corrupt enough in New York City. I could have written a whole biography just on him.
Maybe the next one, Debbie.
Well, you know what? Yeah. None of us are going to live long enough for that.
Okay.
But when the FBI start following her in the mid 30s and through the 40s, she's constantly just dropping into the FBI field office in New York City and chatting with them. And the reports she's quite clear. Listen, I know Jimmy Walker and Walter Winchell. Don't give me too much grief because I have some ways of making noise for you. And in fact, the FBI never did get her on anything. Never did. They did chase. I think the FBI was more interested, frankly, in getting dirt on some of her customers. The one they really tried hard to get more dirt on was Winthrop Rockefeller. But in the end, he was just a good, clean young man who was looking for a good time. So nothing too fancy there.
So when I was pitching this book at Doubleday and elsewhere, the comparison that I leaned on pretty hard was, Polly Adler is the real Jay Gatsby, and everybody comes to Polly's. However, my wife and I have been working our way back through The Sopranos. And I think, what do you think about comparisons between Polly Adler and Tony Soprano as figures in the American cultural mosaic? I can justify that.
It's interesting because earlier I might have said, listen, no, women are second-class citizens in this time in general, even legitimate women, but in the underworld, it's even more true. And if you notice The Sopranos, that's true there too. And even more so if you are in the sex trades, that is definitely a low status thing. And so I would never have made that comparison because I thought, how could you possibly be that powerful? But I'll tell you what, by the end, when I was really working in looking at the people who knew her and who were talking about her in her later career, they talk about her as the only woman in the National Crime Syndicate who had real power, the only woman who went to their dinners, who went to their meetings, not many meetings, but she did. She was not an equal exactly, but as one crime reporter said, her word was law in the underworld, not just in New York, but in 3 states around. So I think, she never wanted to. I'll say this, when I found the notes from her ghostwriter, one of the things that was, of course, wonderful was she's giving the real names to a lot of the people that she cut out or she changed. But there is one list at the end of the notebook that said, "Not to be named" is the name of the list. And on that list was the name of every single major living crime figure at the time that she was writing the book. And that included everyone.
Well, that also has to do with surviving to live another year after your book is published.
Exactly.
I mean, quite seriously. But when I'm thinking of Tony Soprano, I was thinking more of the psychological makeup. I mean, they both support their families. And the families really don't want to know where the support is coming from. They have like cultural inferiority complexes that they work pretty hard to overcome. They're really successful in their shadowy professions, and they're both proud of it. And like Tony's always saying, "I don't want this for my kids," And
and she says at the end, near the end of her life, when she's doing a lot of interviews after her book comes out, she's obviously made a good life for herself. She's still alive when lots of them, very, very few still are. She retires out to California. She's living pretty much in peace. She's got plenty of money. And which she also says is partially a regular annuity for keeping quiet about Franklin Roosevelt. So that helps. Again, we don't know for sure, but she does tell an interviewer, "I will just never be happy. I wake up at night sometimes crying and wondering, who am I?" Because now she's not so busy and she has too much time to think about her past. And as she even says, to think not just about her past, but human nature. I will never be happy because I have seen too much of human nature. And that strikes me. You have sold me on the Tony Soprano comparison, because I think that is right. That
I'm gonna use that as my paper, Prof. My American Studies
exactly.
paper. I just want to say that the most interesting artifact you showed me. We'll get to the questions now after this one. There, you have a signature, something signed from Frank Sinatra, and he says, "Polly, I adore you, Frank." Right?
Francis. Because of that, I have 2. She has some autograph books that are owned by a collector in California, and I'm telling you, the people who came through and signed her autograph books were just Vladimir Nabokov, Mary McCarthy, Burt Lancaster.
Did you say Nabokov? Really?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I forgot that. Wow.
Yeah, that's right. And it couldn't have been more flattering what he had to say. And Frank Sinatra appears very early on. And he writes with the formality of, like, as if the way he talks in the Guys and Dolls movie, with that kind of trying to be fancy, but not quite having it. And he signs it Frank Sinatra because he's very young and he's on the up and coming side of his career. By the time he's writing "Polly, I adore you, Francis," they clearly know each other a lot better. It's quite lovely.
Yeah. So I'm going to go to some questions now. One of our people in the audience asked, I think, a pretty obvious one. So what kind of records did you use to write this biography? I mean, you would have, obviously, she was much covered in the press. So your newspapers.com subscription got to work out, and then the book and the notes from the book. What were the other records that you found? How did you
I should say, by the way, to anyone who's interested, if you go to newspapers.com, which is really just a tremendous, fascinating resource, there's an archive of some 400 something articles in there, I believe, under my name that anyone can just access if you're looking to look a little bit more into the subject. For some reason, the gods, the muses decided they wanted this book to be done. That's one of the reasons it's so big, and one of the reasons it took so long was I was shocked at how many sources I was able to find. Most importantly, as I mentioned, I was able to find through a junk dealer who had saved it from being demolished, the notes from Polly Adler's ghostwriter, Virginia Faulkner, who really did a tremendous service both in writing the book and in documenting so many of the behind-the-scene details.
And who, strangely enough, was part of the Willa Cather revival.
Yes, led it, actually, very important. And just a terrific, a friend in my imagination. Some of Polly had at least two trunks when she died, of scrapbooks and newspaper clippings and programs and little keepsakes, photographs, books, tons of books from friends who'd signed them for her. Unfortunately, her brother, the last surviving member of her family, was very ashamed of Polly's profession, despite taking her money, and threw most of them away, which I still harbor a tremendous grudge against Sam Adler to this day, even though he's been long gone. However, some of them were saved by the woman who took care of him, Eleanor Vera, who was kind enough to let me borrow all of them. I have many, many fabulous photographs in the book, and I could have had many, many more. Those two sources were fabulous. But then I made one of Polly's relatives, Smedar Gilboa, it became a master genealogist. So she helped me connect with family who had many memories. I have to credit
the legendary Aunt Polly.
Yeah, exactly. Although sadly, family members do not know as much about that sort of thing as you would hope, as you can imagine. Things like her village. There was a book put together, a Yiskor book, a memorial book, described with essays from all the people who were still alive from her village back in Russia. It was there was a massive FBI file. There were criminal records at the New York Municipal Society Association. There were just more.
But not all of them. A lot of them sort of went away, didn't they? Yes.
For some reason, the women's records were retained. Most of them went away. In fact, she herself, it was a constant problem. They were always fingerprinting and taking her mugshots, and the mugshots and fingerprints were always disappearing. Every time the FBI went to look for them, they couldn't find any of them. I've got to credit even Google Books, which of course is a source of ambivalence to every author, but for obscure memoirs and old sources that you would never have been able to find, I certainly have to say I really credit them. It was really more than I had any right to hope for, really.
So another person in the audience asked, how strongly did Polly identify as Jewish?
Oh, she was very Jewish. She was studying with a rabbi when she left for America. There's a story that I did not manage to put into the book because they just couldn't fit everything, but of a journalist, a young journalist going to visit Polly and another one of her friends, a woman named Spivvy, just one name, who was a sort of foghorn voiced nightclub performer. And he went over their house for dinner, and it was the two of them, the young journalist and the two older ladies, the young journalist and a girl who kind of wandered in between calls. And he was saying, they were talking about how Polly and Spivvy had both had educations by rabbinical educations. They had studied even Hebrew, which was not that common. And he was like, this is too good to be true. And so they got out a New Year's card, a Rosh Hashanah card, and each showed them off their best Hebrew and their best Yiddish to prove that, in fact, nope, quite Jewish. And you know, I think like a lot of her generation, she might quarrel with God. She might not even have believed in God, but her world was entirely shaped by that. And by the way, a big part of her success was Jews dominated bootlegging and drug dealing in the 20s. So there's nothing like being able to speak Yiddish when Yiddish is the language of the criminals.
While we're on the subject of race and ethnicity, I mean, I think we should maybe mention her black maid Showboat, who was with her through good times and bad, and what, but got repaid for it by not being written into her autobiography at all.
Well, listen, you could not, black maids were incredibly important to keeping the whole underworld going, but especially the brothels, especially the gold diggers. You can see them in various kinds of portrayals in old movies, pre-code movies and that sort of thing, actually. And many brothels were based on having a fabulous, important, efficient second in command. And that's what Polly had. That was a big part of her success. That Showboat was her second in command. But Showboat was her equal in more than one way, and one was in hard-nosed negotiation. And the reason why Showboat is not in the accurately portrayed in her memoir, in Polly's memoir, is because she demanded several $1,000s. This is back in the 1950s. To use her name and story, and Polly was very frugal. Frugality is a critical way to make it in her business, and she was going to be goddamned if she paid a cent to her. And so at the last minute had to rewrite everything about her and write her out of the book, which was a real shame. I think a great loss to the historical record as well as to the book.
So I'm going to combine two questions here because I think they're getting at questions of contemporaneity. One person asked whether it was a challenge to be writing a book about prostitution in a time of Jeffrey Epstein and the obvious censoriousness is to be, you know, the scandal over that. And another person was asking whether Polly benefited more from being in business terms, I guess, and more from being in the business that she was in the 20s than, say, Sydney Biddle Barrows was when she was running her call girl business in the 70s and 80s. I think what people are getting at is, how did it feel writing about some of the retrograde subject of prostitution, seemingly, in our current cultural climate?
Well, answer that last question first, which is, was it more profitable? And Polly herself says, no, it was more profitable. One of the reasons she retires is because, you know, people just didn't use prostitute. You didn't go to a brothel for a good time, like if you were just a bunch of guys out and about, the way you might have in the old days. The prostitution in general was losing some of its currency, in part because there was more premarital sex. You did not need to do it that way. And there was the idea of the good woman and bad woman was beginning to break down. So in general, it was a less profitable business. It was more of literally, we're just going to send you out. You're going to do your deed and then you'll come back. There wasn't the bar bill. There wasn't the glamour of having a sort of salon, such as she'd like to think of it. But in fact, that gets to the first question, which is, I struggled all the time I didn't want to glamorize this profession. And yet it's a profession, especially the way she ran it, that is all about creating glamour, creating the illusion of fun, of eternal fun and ecstasy on demand, and all the things that go along with not realizing, with pretending this isn't costing you money and that any woman just wants to be with you. I think the problem with prostitution is, I think it's something we're all thinking a little bit more about now in this age of the internet and OnlyFans and that sort of thing, which is that it is both a profession, a trade that people enter into freely, that they know what they're doing, they're making a decision, they feel they're making the best economic decision for themselves to support their families or to get where they want to go. And it is also a trade, let's call it, I guess, where people are indeed trafficked, people are coerced, where people are degraded terribly, so that it will always, it always has, and it always will include both of those components. So it's very hard to generalize. It's very hard to decide what to do. I think we are having that debate here now in New York State. The other thing is, it is also, you know, it's hard work. It's like being a ditch digger and a nurse and an actress all rolled up.
And a therapist.
A therapist, right, exactly. And you're all rolled up into one. Plus, you are in intimate situations where there is some danger. But even more than that, even if it were just really a real hard job, you are intersecting with people's deepest drives. There, as Freud would say, the only deeper drive is the death drive, eros and thanatos. And if you are at that level, you are intersecting with shame, you are intersecting with deep, dark emotions, and there is always room for humiliation and violence. And so it is, so in the end, what I didn't love writing about it all the time. There were times when it was super fascinating, that I would learn things that you could not know otherwise, because this was a worm's eye view of the culture that you would never have had if you didn't see it through the eyes of these women. But other times it just, I was just disgusted with humanity. And so I guess on the question of prostitution, if I'm asked, I would say I don't really know what should be done, except this. I do think stigmatizing prostitution has served absolutely no purpose. It only has driven down working conditions. It has made it more dangerous, and it is deeply unfair to the people who have practiced it, who freely. So that I would like to see. I would love to see less stigma.
So I think that's a pretty good place to end. I do want to say that although Polly is speaking as your editor and your reader, Polly is just a fabulous and compelling character. You do not pretty up the picture, and I'm not just talking about the picture of the 20s, but the picture of what happened to many of the women who worked for her. There, not that many of them marched off into the sunset on the arm of a Jock Whitney or a regional sales manager. Many of them had real harm done to them and did real harm to themselves. But anyway, Debbie, it was so much fun working with you on this book, and I'm glad it lasted a long time, because we had that much more time to have that fun. And
you say that now, but you are not remembering some of the moments where you literally wanted to throttle me, and you held back, and for that I will always be grateful.
Okay, yeah, I didn't murder you. He never killed. That's what I'm gonna put it on the plaque. He never killed an author.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you, Jerry, for your faith and your patience. Thank you to Kai for that beautiful blurb, and to Ms. White and to the Leon Levy Center. You have no idea how much having your support makes this lonely job so much easier.
Okay. All right. So long, everyone, and thanks for tuning in.